right, this is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. We have with us Ryan Brady and Andrew Fulginiti. How you guys doing today?
Doing great.
Good, Mark.
And on the phone, we have with us Jerome Segal, the founder of the Bread and Roses Party. It's the first socialist party to be basically established in the United States in 4 decades, and it's been certified here in the state of Maryland. So we have actually Mr. Segal on the phone. Welcome, Mr. Segal.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
So, Mr. Segal, I really thank you so much for being here with us and having a conversation with us here with Mark and the Millennials. As you know, Mark and the Millennials is a show that's about baby boomers as well as folks who are part of the millennial generation. We have Andrew Fulginiti, who's part of that millennial generation, and of course, Ryan Brady, who's also part of that same millennial generation. And naturally, I'm the baby boomer. We also have Adam Couture, who's our tech guy, so I really want to thank him being here today. So we want to find out a little bit about you first, Mr. Segal. Tell us what you're retired, my understanding is. What have you done all of your life in your professional life?
Oh, well, that's a long story, but I have a doctorate in philosophy. So at one point, I had a straight academic career, but I came to Washington in 1975 and worked for the Congress for 4 years as a policy analyst, and then went into the executive branch and worked another 10 years as a policy analyst in the Agency for International Development.
Wow.
And then I went, along the way, I picked up a second master's degree in public affairs, and then went to the University of Maryland, where for 20 years or so, I was part of the School of Public Policy at the Institute for Philosophy and Public Affairs.
Okay.
And then just recent, I wrote, what's relevant, I think, in particular, is a lot of my work has really been about the intersection of, I'd say, economics and ethics, or not in the normal sense of ethics, but economics and questions of value. And I wrote a book in 1999 called Graceful Simplicity, The Philosophy and Politics of the Alternative American Dream. And that book was a substantial basis for the campaign that I waged in June of this last year when I ran against Maryland's sitting Senator Ben
Cardin, who's been in office, I think, forever. Everywhere from
for 50 years, that's right. Oof. And I ran against him in the Democratic Party for the nomination for Senate. And unlike Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who also took on an establishment politician in the Democratic Party and ran as an identified socialist, she won and I lost. Very different story. I left the Democratic Party and decided to found this new party called Bread and Roses. And
why Bread and Roses?
Just recently, pardon?
Why Bread and Roses?
So the term Bread and Roses actually it comes from a banner that women workers leading a very famous strike in 1912 of textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts. They marched under a banner that said bread and roses too. And of course, everybody knew what bread meant. It meant, higher wages and so on. Roses is a very complex notion that can be defined in many ways. But it really very much fits the concept of gracefulness in my book, but it has a historic meaning because it was located in this really very powerful and important strike in the history of both the labor movement and the women's movement.
Okay.
And it has multiple meanings. One has to do with simply the issue of time rather than money. And the strike actually, in part, was triggered by Massachusetts had lowered at that point the minimum, or rather had lowered the maximum work week from 56 hours a week to 52 hours a week. So it was actually a time issue that triggered the strike. But what happened was that the owners of the companies when they couldn't keep the workers at the workplace more than 52 hours, rather than giving them their same pay, which is what they expected, they took 4 hours of work out of their pay. So when they opened up their pay envelopes, they got less money than the week before, and spontaneously, tens of thousands of them just poured out into the street,
Okay.
yelling "short pay," and
Okay.
the strike began.
So you're obviously,
So time is one issue.
I got you. So you're
Time is
obviously
one issue.
an academic on so many levels, no doubt about that with your education. I appreciate that explanation of Bread and Roses. Just from a boomer standpoint, naturally we love Guns and Roses, so we thought perhaps that might be more catching. But I get why you have Bread and Roses, which is great. We tried to throw some humor in here too, if you haven't noticed. So you said you wrote a book, and part of the title is The Alternative American Dream. What is the alternative American dream?
Yeah. Okay. And actually, here's an interesting thing. We polled for the primary. We polled Maryland Democrats on their version of the American dream, and we gave them three choices. One was to be in essentially the top 10% and have substantial money and so on. The second was to be in the top 1% to really make it in America and have as much money as you could want. And the third was actually to actually live a modest life as far as money was concerned, but to have enough to meet your needs, to have secure income, but enough leisure, and that's the time issue, so that actually you could do the things in life that were most important. And we found over 70% of people opted for the third as their version of the American dream. And that's very much what I wrote about and what I meant by the alternative American dream.
But how do
which
you?
is one that actually looks for
That's
a
interesting
more
because
simple life.
sure, but
go ahead.
that's interesting because that takes us to really kind of the central theme of, I think, what often folks believe is socialism and the Socialist Party, and that is you do have a lot of time on your hands because in perfect, Marxism, Leninism, each person works according to their ability and takes according to their need, right? Isn't that what you're saying? I mean, people
Well,
have.
yeah, but that doesn't actually that's compatible with 40 hours a week or 30 hours a week. In other words, everybody's got the ability to work 30 or 40 or 20. So that formula doesn't specify it. And that's why Bread and Roses, in a certain sense, is a new kind of socialism.
How so?
Because actually, what we're trying to do is to put the issue of work time as well as quality of work.
So the average person works
back
40.
on the national agenda.
I got it. So the average person works 40 hours a week, and what you're saying is you want them to work less than 40 hours a week?
At least to have an option to do that. That's right. And
But
one
what
way
if?
to
But what if
think
you're?
about
But
it-
so Mr. Segal, if you're a doctor, right, and you're an ER doctor, and it's a
Yes.
particularly busy time in the ER, you can't just leave.
Oh, no, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a doctor in philosophy.
No. I'm saying as an example, okay, about cutting
okay.
hours for workers. Let's say that you have an ER doctor. An individual is
Yeah.
a doctor. He works in the ER. She works in the ER. And the ER, of course, it's very unpredictable. Sometimes there's nothing happening. Sometimes there's a lot of stuff happening. And all of a sudden, it
Yeah.
becomes really busy. You've reached over the 20-hour work limit that has been set on you. And so what do? You just walk out? I mean, what if you have to work 80 hours that week?
No, I mean, look, first of all, I mean, you're taking, the answer is no, not
Okay.
in the ER. And
Okay.
nobody would do that. But the point is that
So not everybody
there's
would
a
be
standard-
eligible.
There's a standard work week, whether you're in the ER or not, so that
But see,
let's say today the expectation is for let's take your example. The expectation today might be that someone who is in the ER would work, an 8-hour day, but of course be flexible if there are emergencies. All I'm saying is that they should have a choice as to whether or not the standard expectation is an 8-hour day or a 6-hour day, or if they wanted a 4-hour day. In other words,
so if
that
they work
people
a
should
6
have
hour
the-
if they work a 6-hour day versus an 8-hour day, they should be paid less for the 6 hours, right?
Well, I think that would have to be the case.
So
if it was as drastic as that, but what we could have as a different way of thinking about it, for instance, is a requirement for paid vacations in the country without any reduction in pay.
How does that happen? How does that work? How does that work?
First of all, it works in every other industrialized country in the world. So the United States is the only country in the world that doesn't have a requirement of a paid vacation. And part of the way you do it, you see, is the way we did it in the United States for decades and decades, which is that when you have productivity growth, which means this productivity growth basically means that for a given hour of work, more output can be generated. And when you have productivity growth, in theory, there are actually two different ways of benefiting from it.
So no, but I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, and I understand that. But what you're saying essentially is for me to restate this, probably because obviously we want to say this in terms that everybody can understand. You're saying that the productivity of any individual doesn't belong to that individual; it belongs to the collective, and then the collective.
No, what I'm saying is, as a society.
But that's the collective.
We have, that's true. The society is the collective. What I'm saying is that if you look for, let me put it in slightly different terms. One thing that everybody is aware of is that we've had, in the last 2 decades, we've had an enormous expansion of the economy overall. One. And two is that most of the benefit of that has gone to people at the very upper end of the income spectrum. That the benefits of that growth and its productivity growth that I'm talking about here hasn't been equally shared, right? So there's something about the way our markets work or are controlled that is resulting in the average person benefiting very little by the growth in the economy, and almost all of the income growth that's coming from that going to people at the very top of the income spectrum. Okay. Well, one of the things is that if instead of the economy
so basically larger, what you're saying is basically
wait, you keep on interrupting every sentence. I can never finish one thought, Mark. hold your horses just a second here. Okay. So what I'm saying, in other words, is an alternative approach would be, and I think should be, if all of us worked, 1% less a year, actually, essentially a large chunk of that growth of productivity wouldn't be translated into income. It would be translated into time, but everybody in the society would get the benefit of that growth in productivity, because we all get an hour less, and our incomes wouldn't go down because it would be sustained by productivity growth. So in one sense, what you're saying is correct, is that what I'm talking about is using public policy to affect how the distribution of productivity is achieved.
So essentially redistributing income. I mean, Mayor de Blasio just said the same thing. He said the problem with the United States is there's plenty of money. It's a wealthy country. It's just all in the wrong hands. Is that what you're saying? You're saying the same thing?
No, I'm saying something different, but I agree with that also.
So how do we get it? How do we get it from the wrong hands into the right hands? And who are the right hands?
Okay. Well, first of all, there are two different things that can be distributed. One is leisure time, and the other is money. And what I'm talking about.
But they're both the same. I mean, leisure time. Someone.
Both, I think.
Go ahead.
Both, I agree that that both income and even more than income, wealth is extraordinarily unequal in the United States. And the answer to the question is yes. I favor using public policy in a variety of ways to move towards not just a society with equal opportunity, but a society
of equal
that has
results.
More equal outcome.
You want equal outcomes.
Equal outcome.
So you
I
want
would say equal, but more equal.
You want equal outcomes, even no matter what the effort is of the individual. I mean, because that's really
listen. You're leaving out the word more. I'm saying more equal outcomes.
So
I'm not saying that.
what should the effective tax rate be in the state of Maryland, in the United States? What should the effective tax rate be?
Well, if you're looking at all taxes, my guess is that that for the United States, the percentage of gross domestic product that actually goes to taxes is probably, I believe it's between 25 to 30% of the economy. That's I think the lowest of any industrialized country. So I don't have a problem if that goes. I don't have a problem in theory if that goes higher. But what I'm talking about right now,
because AOC wants 70%.
Mark, let me finish a sentence, please.
Okay, I was just saying, Alexandria Court.
Let's make a deal. I won't interrupt you.
Well, the thing is right now we're glad that we're interviewing you, but we're trying to get in the questions so that we don't because we have a limited amount of time. We're trying to get in as many questions as we can.
You're not letting me answer them. So what good is hammering me with more?
But let me ask. Can I just ask you a quick question? Can I ask you a quick question about? So Alexandria Cortez wants 70% tax rate, at least for today.
That's the marginal rate. That's not the effective rate.
Okay.
That's what she wants for the last dollar. In other words, she's not saying that people should pay, even at the top, she's not saying that they should pay 70% of their income. She's saying that, listen, if you're making $10 million and you make, then you make an extra dollar, 10 million and one, that last dollar you should pay 70%. But she's talking about a progressive tax rate so that the rate actually goes up on each increment that you make. And I think that's a good idea. I think probably 70% marginal tax rate is way too high because it just creates so much incentive for people to find other ways of holding on to their money that at the end of the day, it doesn't work and it produces all sorts of problems. But we have a progressive tax code right now. Part of the problem with it is, first of all, that people already find loopholes for getting around it.
Okay, so
I'll give you an example with the capital gains tax. So, with capital gains tax, when somebody dies, they pass on to their heirs all of their capital gains without ever paying any capital gains tax. The heirs don't pay it either. So that's just sort of like a straightforward.
Well, there's an inheritance tax
loophole.
There's an inheritance
tax. The inheritance tax is something that even if they did pay capital gains, the inheritance tax has an exemption now. I think it's up to $10 million.
I mean, I'm self-employed, and I pay capital gains all the time as a self-employed person throughout my entire life.
Right, but here's what I'm saying is that, let's say when you die, right? Let's say your stock portfolio shows $1 million of capital gains, but you don't sell those stocks. When you die, that entire portfolio passes to your heirs, and then they can sell your entire portfolio with $1 million of capital gains, but no capital gains tax is paid on that sale because the price at which capital gains are figured for your heirs is the price of the stock, not when you bought it, but the price of the stock when you died. So capital gains on your account is avoided by you passing it on to your heirs. So it's a very unusual but very powerful loophole that allows the wealthiest people in the country to escape paying taxes on capital gains by just holding on to them and then passing them to the heirs. So that's an example.
So hold on one second. I just want to. So just hold on one second. So we have I have a million questions for you, obviously, but we want to go to our first millennial, which is Andrew Fulginita. So go, Andrew's got a couple of questions. Go, Fuji.
Yeah, hi there, Mr. Segal. As a millennial, I'm a graduate of State University. I haven't had direct contact with the form of government of socialism, so I'm kind of interested in hearing a little bit more about your vision of socialism for Maryland and what your party stands for. I tried doing a little bit of research myself as to what socialism, what it would look like, and I was reading a little bit from the Socialist Strategy in the Age of Political Revolution. Now, the DSA that was published in 2016. And really, I was looking at the portion that talks about our vision of democratic socialism. So what it would look like. in practice. And kind of what I pulled out from it, and I'll read just briefly from it, says, our vision of democratic socialism is necessarily partial and speculative, and is in no way intended to be the blueprint for a democratic socialist society. To the contrary, the specific contours of the future of which we aspire will be democratically determined not by us, but rather by those who live in it. So kind of what I drew from that is that, they believe in rule of the people and democracy and vote of all the people. My concern with that, and I'm hoping maybe you can address this in your answer, is, Hamilton talked about this to Jefferson. We talked about tyranny of the majority. How does those protections go into the Socialist Party? How do you prevent mob rule if that is the vision of socialism for Maryland? So maybe you could just touch on that and just give us, as a millennial, what is socialism and what would it look like implemented in Maryland?
Yeah, okay, so part of what you're talking about is the relationship of the political process to
Looks a lot the way Maryland looks
the
today.
economic decisions and the question of democracy. So first off, at least, and I'll just talk about my version of socialism, which isn't necessarily
Right.
Theirs, and some of the ways it's different, among other things, is that I'm not particularly interested in government ownership of the means of production or national planning and so forth. But I am a democratic socialist, and I don't envision any changes in the Constitution to get to where I want to get. So from a political point of view, all of our constitutional law and protections and civil liberties and Bill of Rights and so on, all of that stays in place. On the other hand, I am very concerned, for instance, about political power in the United States, and in particular the role of super wealthy people in determining the outcome of our democracy. And that concretely comes down to super PACs and the control of elections and the outcomes of elections, not just by, what millions of people think, but by which candidates get, gigantic contributions of super PAC money behind them and then can dominate in elections. I just went through an election and there's a tremendous value to incumbents and to who the media supports and so on. And one of the changes that I'm interested in, actually, I don't think that, we had that Supreme Court case of Citizens versus United, which allowed individuals in a non-coordinated fashion to give as much money as they want to political campaigns. And the Supreme Court said that that's protected under our Constitution. And I don't think there's really any hope for a constitutional amendment that would reverse that Supreme Court decision. But what we can do, if you look at the total amount of money that gets spent on political campaigns in this country, even with millionaires throwing in tremendous amounts of money, it actually turns out to be a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the economy, about $6 billion. And that could actually be overcome not by limiting the amount of money that the very wealthy can give, but actually by encouraging and empowering people at the very bottom of the income spectrum to give money. So, for instance, if you have 100 million voters, right, and every voter gave $10, that's $1 billion right there. If every voter gave, $50 billion, that's $5 billion. So just by empowering the ordinary person to give $50, whether they've got it in their pocketbook or not, right, we could counterbalance all of the money and more that giant wealthy people have in controlling, who occupies the positions of power. And so one way to do that, for instance, is through the tax system. We have something called a refundable tax credit, called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which actually the Nixon administration introduced as an anti-poverty measure, very successful. But it's the idea of a refundable credit, which means that when somebody's income is so low that you can't cut their taxes anymore it's a mini version of a negative income tax. People actually get a check from the government at tax time. Well, you could extend that
Money for
to
not working, in other words.
contributions that people make to political candidates up to a minimum level, like $25 a person or $50 a person. But just doing that tiny thing actually would neutralize the giant fortunes.
So that's interesting.
So it's a creative tweak that actually will add almost nothing to the federal budget.
So I think it's fascinating the part you say about, you're interested in keeping the Constitution intact and the Bill of Rights, and that's an interesting part of it. And obviously you're part of the get money out of politics movement. I mean, is there anything else in particular that you see as an important, like a key critical, component of socialism, your social view of socialism in Maryland?
Yeah, I would mention two things. Well, first of all, one goes back to roses, and we're actually for us, it means a variety of things. One I said was time.
Will you accept this rose?
Another, beauty and creativity, okay, and meaning. So we're interested in quality of work, meaningful jobs, preserving the beauty of the natural environment, increasing the beauty of the man-made environment, and basically finding ways to bring about renaissance in America, stimulating creativity. So it's not just something happening in New York and San Francisco, but it's something that's happening, in every community around the country. And one of the things that goes to is the relationship, and this should be very important to young people. It's the relationship between schools and jobs, right? And one of the things that goes on right now is that the concept of education, I think, is dropping out of the mission of schools. Schools are increasingly seen as things whose major function is to help people be successful job seekers, right? And curriculum changes and what people study and so on. And what I think it's doing is distorting the schools, and it's putting enormous anxiety on the family, and it's stressing out students. It's destroying childhood, and it's basically giving the schools a function that actually schools can't solve. What schools can't solve is the problem that there aren't enough good jobs in the society. And while every individual person looks to their own kids' schooling as something that will make them, a better competitor, you can't do that collectively. It's like Lake Wobegon. You can't have more than half of the people above average. And everybody wants their kid to be in the top, 1% of the candidates. Well, at the end of the day, only 1% do it. But if we rev up the competition for that, we drive everyone crazy.
So let me ask you this question.
What we're interested in is taking schools out of the issue of succeeding in the current job system, and instead changing it to how do you make people more independent of the job system, and how do schools provide a basis for a meaningful life that doesn't rest on getting into the top 10%.
So let me ask you this question. I mean, do you think that, so you're saying there's this problem and the goal of colleges has changed and there's pressure on them now and pressure on the families. Do you think that in any way as a result to the increased access to student loans pushed by, previous administrations, that they're really allowing, it's so easy for students and families nowadays to get, access to student loans and increasing the number of people that are going to college? Do you think that has in any way effect to what you were talking about?
I do, though I would broaden it. I think that, and this is a very deep problem in the society, which is that we have two fundamental objectives in our society as we think about it. One is a justice fairness thing that we could call equal opportunity or ending discrimination. And we have this tremendous legacy, a historical legacy of horrible discrimination in the United States, the worst, of course, being the slavery period and so on. But we've got tremendous and continued lack of equal opportunity, and we've made tremendous progress and so on in overcoming that. The other thing that we've got, though, is a desire for happiness and for lives that work well and so on. And one of the things that happens is that in a society in which you only have a narrow band of people who can be winners, and the difference between winners and losers is very great. The more equal opportunity you give, the more of a conflict you have between allowing people who are at the bottom a real chance to get into the middle, and then what happens to the people at the middle. Because if what happens to the people at the middle is, you see, it's like rungs in a ladder. If they have to give up their position in the middle to people who are below them, then they end up, relatively speaking, towards the bottom. And if being, relatively speaking, towards the bottom means actually that your life is terrible because the actual situation at the bottom is terrible, then you've got this conflict, you see, a built-in conflict between people in the middle and people at the bottom, and so you've got a real struggle. And the way out of that is part of what we're talking about.
So, Mr. Segal, this is
Mark. A more
Mark.
equal society.
We got you.
Where the difference between being at the top and being at the bottom isn't acute.
Yep. So, Mr. Segal, you're talking essentially that it's your view. This is Mark Fisher. It's your view then that we have a zero-sum economy, right? That's what it sounds like. You're saying that everybody's position is static and there's no upward mobility. But there is upward mobility in the United States. I mean, the people who were poor 50 years ago are rich by today's standard, or certainly middle class by today's standards. I mean, certainly the idea when I was growing up in Baltimore, as a poor kid in Baltimore, the idea that we would have 3 or 4 TVs in our house is unheard of, right? I mean, there's a lot of upward mobility in the United States. There are also, I think, my understanding is last time I checked, there were 7 million unfilled jobs. I mean, there are lots of really good jobs. Yeah. They're unfilled because their education system isn't doing its job. So, the idea that someone has to do poorly for someone to do well is not the way our economy works. So
there are two different meanings, and they're both important to upward mobility and to doing well. One is where you end up in the social hierarchy. Okay, so we've got the top 10%, the top 20. We've got people at the top and people at the bottom. That's a zero-sum game. Okay, because not everyone could be at the top. If one person makes it into the top, you have to make room for them, and that forces somebody else out. The other is
I'm not sure that's. I have to disagree. I respectfully disagree because
the
idea.
That's a logical truth.
Well, no, it's not a logical truth because
can be in the top 25%.
The person who invented Facebook, of course, created something that was completely new and unheard of. And he did not displace anyone. He just invented something that was completely new.
No, what I'm saying is...
So the people at the top didn't have to make room for him. There was already room because there was no such thing as Facebook when he invented it.
No, yeah, well, we're talking... What I'm trying to get you to recognize...
Is you're a philosopher.
There are two different concepts of upward mobility, and both of them are important. One of them has to do with what you're talking about, which is that the rising tide lifts all boats and everybody lives at a higher physical standard than they were before.
Right. Very Kennedy-esque.
The second concept is a relative one in which everybody tries to get to the top of the ladder. In terms of relative well-being, you can never have more than 25% of the population in the top quarter. Okay, that's what I mean by a logical truth. You can never have more than 50% who are in the upper half of the society. Okay, so in relative terms, anybody from the bottom who makes it into the top displaces someone from the top into the bottom. So that's the zero-sum part. Now the question is, you've got both of those things operating, and they've got relatively different powers, and sometimes, as in recent years, the first one actually stops working. So if you look at, for instance, the first one, which is the actual amount of inflation-adjusted money, let's say, that people are taking home, and you look at, say, like what's happened in the last 20 years, as opposed to what happened in the 20 years before that, what you'll see is that median household income has gone up very, very little for the last 20 years, in part because most of the gain that's been there in the last 20 years hasn't been equally distributed. So it's not a case that even in terms of that one, that we've had the rising tide lifts all boats. What we've had is actually the yachts have gone up and the rowboats have stayed pretty much where they are.
But the middle
So
class,
that's one
meanwhile,
kind of
but
issue
the middle
that
class,
people
meanwhile,
are
has
very
expanded.
concerned about, and it's something that's different
So,
in the
Mr.
last couple of decades than it was, let's say, in the
Right.
post-World War
Right.
II
So-
era.
But
Okay,
Mr.
go ahead.
Segal, yeah, the middle class has indeed expanded. The percentage of the middle class and also the overall number of the middle class. There's no doubt, obviously, that it's always difficult to move up on the ladder. But I think that it's pretty clear that you'd rather be in the lower half in the United States in terms of income than to be in the lower half in Venezuela in terms of income. I mean, this is where people want to be.
But that's not. You see, one of the aspects of my socialism is that I'm
That it's not
utopian.
like Venezuela?
Pre-Marxist. So I don't particularly think Venezuela is in our future.
Well, I'm glad. I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that.
It's something much better than what we have. So yeah. So
Ryan Brady would like to ask you. Ryan is the other millennial. So here's Ryan. Go ahead, Ryan. Go ahead.
How's it going, Mr. Segal? As I was listening to this conversation very intently, I do have to agree that some of your ideas do have merits, and I tend to agree on some things. Some things.
Wow.
Hey. Philosophical exercise, political thought, political theory, very intriguing to me. About your party, I just have one question to pose to you, as we're seeing on a more national level and as we can see this be played out in the state of Maryland. As the Democrat Party is pulled farther to the left by progressives, nationally and in the state of Maryland, do you think we will see Democrats defect to your burgeoning party?
Well, I think that what we're talking about actually will resonate very well with people who are Democrats and non-Democrats right across the political spectrum. So for instance, now I don't have data on Republicans, but when our polls showed that 70% of Maryland Democrats said that their version of the American dream was something in which they were not aspiring to get to the top of the income ladder. What they wanted was a decent income, economic security, and more leisure time. When 70% of the Democrats in Maryland say that that's their version of their economic dream, that tells me that we're not out in the fringes. And it may be that Republicans see that differently. I don't think so. I think, among other things, and I'm not saying that Republicans are more religious than Democrats, but I would say that people who have a religious tradition and take it seriously, every religious tradition basically has de-emphasized the role of money in life. And the trade-off that I'm talking about, by the way, of less money and some leisure, a lot of different things to do with leisure, and one of them is to go to church. And the first time that we ever had laws in Western civilization that said, hold it, there's a limit on what amount of time that you're allowed to spend earning money, and the rest of the time you've got to do something else. You know when that was? 2,500 years ago. It's in the Bible. That's what the Sabbath is. And in the Bible, the first person that's put to death for violating God's law is someone who violates the Sabbath. He's someone who goes out on the seventh day, and rather than resting or doing whatever you're supposed to do, the very first person, right, to be killed for breaking God's law, even before the Ten Commandments are issued, is a guy who insists, on the march from Egypt during the Exodus.
Yep.
He goes out on the seventh day and he starts collecting sticks.
Excuse me, Mr. Segal. Can I bring it back to the real quick to the Democrats' defection part? And then you talked about your poll that you saw a lot of people have more leanings towards where your party is making its statement.
Yes,
But I have to counter that. I really don't see one big growing now minority that's slowly growing is independents, which almost seem to be more of a moderate and centrist mentality where they like to take ideas from the right and from the left and try to actually create a compromise where you see more of a bipartisanship angle where they would want to work within the capitalist society and not really more fall over to more the left, more progressive, where we may see socialist burgeoning parties such as Bread and Roses in the state of Maryland and elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I think you may be right about, which is that I'm not convinced that the concept socialist is, from political point of view, actually the most useful way to frame it. And we have to think long and hard about whether or not. Now, I identified as a socialist, but put in the Washington Post and the Baltimore Sun at the time an article in which I tried to explain what I meant by socialist.
Well, in Maryland, it's
Party,
okay to change your identity.
If you look at our website,
We have.
if you look at our website, what I actually said, what it says on the website, is that the Bread and Roses Party is open to socialists and non-socialists alike.
So
And the
marketing
reason
strategy.
I say that is that the concept of socialism is rooted really in a period of time over a century ago, in which the economic problems and issues that we face are really quite different than they are today.
A stage
So
of
there's a
society
lot
and
of
Marxist
baggage to
theory
that
traditional
term.
between capitalism and communism and distinguished by unequal distribution of goods and pay according to work done, according to Merriam-Webster, is what they define as socialism. Do you agree to that?
I couldn't hear you too well, but what I do share from Marx is what you quoted earlier, which is from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, which maybe that's
Bingo.
what you're getting at. I think that that's an ideal that we should move from, or to move to. And I think another way to put it is to try to separate somebody's ability to satisfy core needs from the income that they actually have, so long as they're making a contribution. In other words, as long as they're working, I think that we should have a social contract in which people's core needs are met,
Yep.
and that could be through higher income, like the higher minimum wage. It could through the earned income tax credit.
So a
living
Green New
wage.
Deal that's being pushed by Casio?
That's
A flavor of it?
That's one. It's one particular set of policies. It's probably something that in general terms I would support. It's pro-environment.
Kind of hard to be against the environment in Maryland.
Policy, and I do believe in a form of guaranteed employment or retraining. So Green New Deal fits well with that. I have other ideas for how to fulfill an enforceable right to a job.
Well, that's also can be pointed towards the education system not providing adequate training or apprenticeships within the high schools to make sure everyone has a trade, because college is not always meant for some people, in my opinion.
Well, actually, I largely agree with that. One of the things that I'm in favor of, for instance, is people getting education in several different things. One would be, I think everyone should learn the basics of startup, and everyone should learn how to start their own nonprofit, in particular, which has gotten much, much easier. But nonprofits are wonderful. They're easy ways to create jobs. You can do it yourself. It only takes one or two people. Even one person can start a nonprofit, and you can go and you can be a nonprofit by basically focusing on an unmet and important social need. And it could be a million things, but it becomes a form of meaningful work. And you can get indirectly government support for that, because contributions to a nonprofit are tax deductible. And that, oddly, is one of the ways in which the government, for years and years through our tax code,
Mr. Segal,
contributed to this.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just caught that one point where you're saying government investment into nonprofits. But the theory is you need to make money and you need to invest in money, spend money to make money, basically, is what I'm getting at. So you're saying that the government would help start these nonprofits, but then where's the influx of money coming after the government gives that hopefully one-time investment to start the nonprofit?
No, that's not what I meant. What I meant was actually just expanding what we've already got. So we've already got a system.
So government-run programs?
The way it works is that the government subsidizes contributions by private individuals to nonprofits. So if you itemize your taxes, you can deduct let's say you contribute $1,000 to to a very nice nonprofit. Well, in fact, you give the nonprofit $1,000, but because you can deduct that from the income that you pay taxes on, effectively you're only actually losing $600. So the nonprofit gets $1,000, but you only lose $600 in your contribution because the government reduces your tax bill by the $400.
So, Mr.
So
Segal, Mr. Segal, you brought a wonderful point up, right? So the idea that an individual with money can give to a nonprofit, and some of that is deductible, right? If it's deductible, but if we're taking a lot of money from individuals who are successful, like Alexandria Cortez, AOC, whatever you want to call her, and kind of like what you're suggesting at really high tax rates, then where's the money going to come from? Because government's already going to have taken the money. And you no longer have you can no longer voluntarily give them money. So I think you just conflicted yourself there.
Well, actually, no, the truth of the matter would be actually the way the system works is that let's say you've got the person with $10 million. If they hold on to it, then they've got to pay it. But actually, if they take $1 million and give it to nonprofits, they deduct that entire $1 million, so that their income that they pay taxes on goes down from 10 million to 9 million. So actually, a very high marginal tax rate becomes a major incentive for them to give it to nonprofits, because they actually could then give $1 million to nonprofits, and it would actually only be giving up 300,000 on their part.
Got it.
It actually becomes a major incentive.
Well, Mr. Segal, I really appreciate you being with us. I think that's kind of all we have time to cover now. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate Ryan Brady and Andrew Fujiniti being here. Thanks, everyone. And Adam Couture and Tech, thanks again for the interview. And we're going to have a lot to talk about in our next podcast. Thanks, Matt. This is Mark and the Millennials.